If I start at the number 4, what number would I have to add in order to reach 0? So here we are starting at 4. What number would I have to add to reach 0? Now since we're moving to the left, what kind of number do you think we're adding? If you said negative, you are correct. When you're adding a negative number, it's the same as subtracting. And how many hops did we count? We counted 4, so therefore we have to add negative 4 to reach 0. Let's write this out. 4 plus negative 4 is equal to 0. A way to think about this is, if you have $4 but you owe your friend $4, which is debt, once you pay that friend off, how much money are you going to have? 0. Okay? So a positive number adding a negative of that number gives you 0 back. Alright, let's start on the left of the number line, or at a negative number. If I start with negative 5, what number would I have to add to reach 0? And in case you were wondering, this lesson is all about reaching 0. What number would you have to add to get 0? All of the examples are going to be that way. Well, let's count the hops. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And since we hop to the right, that's going to be a positive number. So therefore, negative 5 plus 5 gives you 0 back. Let's write that out. And again, if we think about money, if you are $5 in debt, which would represent the negative 5, but then somebody gives you $5, that would give you enough to pay the person back, and you wouldn't owe anybody anything, right? So that's the way of thinking about that practically. Let's do one more. If you started at 6, what number would you have to add to reach 0? Well, this time again we're going to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Since we moved to the left, that would be a negative number. And therefore the answer is negative 6. You'd have to add negative 6 to reach 0. In general, if you start with a number A, let's use this color, you would have to add negative A in order to reach 0. Now I know what you're thinking already. How about this negative example? Well, if you think about it, what we can do with so pretend 5 is the A, okay? Well, if 5 is the A, then actually what's the negative of negative 5? It's just negative 5. So as weird as it looks, we would be adding, let's try this, negative 5. Remember, two negatives make a positive. So yes, A plus negative A, regardless of the number, gives you 0 back. In this case, that's A, and this would be adding negative A. So you have a plus minus minus, which is kind of confusing. But anyway, just wanted to show you that because it works for any number. So again, positive A plus negative A gives you 0 back. This is called the additive inverse property, or sometimes the inverse property of addition. The gist of it is, if you start with a number, what number must you add in order to reach 0? And a quick way of thinking about it is you're just adding the negative version of that number. That's it. Regardless of what the number is, you're adding the negative version. So let me ask you guys this: what's the negative version of 10? Or what's the negative version of positive 10? It's negative 10, right? So therefore 10 plus negative 10 gives you 0 back. And the reason why you add the opposite is because you're going the opposite direction of the number line in order to reach 0. If you start to the right of the number line and you add a negative, you're turning around and moving left by adding a negative number. And if you start with a negative number and you add the opposite sign, which is positive, you're going back right to reach 0. So if you're on the left, you have to move right to reach 0, and if you're on the right, you have to move left to reach 0, and that's why we add the opposite sign. And it's that simple. Let's look at some more examples. Negative 13 plus what number gives you 0 back? Well, what's the opposite sign of negative 13? It would be what? Positive 13, right? So therefore we would add positive 13 to reach 0. This one's a lot more straightforward. Positive 17.2 plus negative 17.2 gives you what? Well, you're adding the negative version of that number, so the gist of the lesson is if you do that, you reach 0. On the number line, you'd be 17.2 to the right, and you'd move 17.2. Here, let's do it this way. Let's actually show this. On the number line, you'd be 17.2 this way, to the right of 0, but then once you add negative 17.2, you move back 17.2 this way, and you end up back at 0. And in future, we're going to look at a lesson which is very similar to this one. Basically, if you start with a number, let's say 8, and then add 5, and then subtract 5, you end back up at 8. So it doesn't just apply to 0, really. 0 plus 10 minus 10 is 0, but it also works for other numbers. 17 plus 5 minus 5 gives you 17, and that's really important because that's a property we use very, very often in math, and it's important you understand it. What number plus negative pi gives you 0? And remember, pi is a number just like any other number, 3.14 on forever. Well, if we added the negative version of pi to get 0, then we must have started with the positive version, so therefore the answer is pi. Again, pi is just like any other number. Okay, let's look at this one together. The square root of e plus what gives you 0? Well, what would be the negative version of this? Actually, all you have to do is just put a negative sign in front, so it would be the negative square root of e. As complicated as that looks, it's that simple. It's just the negative version of that number. And I realize it looks weird, but I wanted to show you this because this type of example will come up a lot later on. As you go into more complicated math, you'll see stuff like this. And I don't want you to just look at simple examples. I want you to get used to the fact that numbers can look complicated sometimes, even though they're really not. Okay, let's read this one together. What number plus 7/3 gives you 0? Well, notice I added a positive number and ended up with 0, so I must have started with what type of number? A negative one. So again, we would be negative 7/3 to the left of the number line, or just say 7/3 to the left. We'd have to add 7/3 to go back to the right, and so therefore that's why it works. Opposites cancel each other out. They balance each other like magnets, right? If you have, that's why magnets stick to each other, because one has one polarity and one has the other. Or one has one, basically a positive or negative magnet type of attraction. Okay, 0 plus what gives you 0? Now, 0 doesn't have a sign, and I don't want you to put negative 0, and that's why I gave you this example. We've already talked about the fact that if you start with 0 and you end up with 0, the only number you could add is 0. But anyway, I guess if you put negative 0, I wouldn't count it wrong. But remember, 0 is in between the negative and positive numbers, so it actually doesn't have a sign. That's more or less a review problem, but it still applies. I guess 0 is its own additive inverse, and I guess that's why I did that example. Yeah. Yeah, if you add 0, you stay at 0. Simple enough. Okay, if I start with the number a, what must I add in to end up with 0? Well, we've already talked about this. This is the inverse property. Any number a, whether it be 17 or 227 or whatever, if you add the negative version of that number, you get 0. Pretty simple, right? And let's go ahead and look at this one. This one's a little bit harder. Let's say I start with a number, okay, and it's this number right here, and I add x, and I end up at 0. What number did I start with? Well, don't make the mistake of putting x in there, because x plus x is 2x. Again, this has to be the opposite of positive x in order to end up with 0. What's the opposite of positive x? It is negative x. So again, sometimes if you get confused with variables, if you're the type of person to have trouble, just plug in a number. Let's say it's negative 10. X is 10. It'd be negative 10 plus 10, which gives you 0. And the more numbers you write out like that, the more you'll see it works for any number, and that's why we just say x, because x represents any number. Wanted to give you something a little bit more complicated, not too much, but if I start with AB, what must I add to end up with 0? Well, I'll give you a hint. It'd be the opposite sign of positive AB, and that would be negative AB. Okay, simple. So no matter how complicated the expression is, in reality you're still just adding the negative version of that number. So in this case it would be negative AB. Not too bad. And that's it for this lesson. This is titled the additive inverse property, or the inverse property of addition, and simply states that if you add the negative version of a number, you will always end up at 0.